Welcome everyone to our session entitled Why It's Important to Know About Clinical Trials. I'm really excited about this session because we have three experts in the field of clinical trials who will teach us and educate us on what it is to participate in a clinical trial, some of the myths that you may have about clinical trials, any of the questions that you might have around clinical trials. We're going to explore from a patient perspective what it is to participate in a clinical trial as part of your treatment. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our three panelists today. First, let's welcome Dr. Christine Brezden-Masley, who is the founder of COMET. And COMET is the acronym for Community Oncologists of Metropolitan Toronto Clinical Trials Consortium, which is a web-based virtual network promoting cancer clinical trials throughout the Toronto region. She treats both breast and gastrointestinal malignancies, which are major areas of research interest also. Her main area of clinical research is cardiotoxicity from cancer therapy, and she is currently the president of the Canadian Cardio-Oncology Network. Dr. Brezden-Masley is also on the board of directors of Rethink Breast Cancer, a national advocacy and support network for young women with breast cancer, and My Gut Feeling, which is a stomach cancer support network for patients, survivors, and caregivers. We also welcome Dr. Carolyn Hamm, who is the Schulich Chair of Windsor Oncology and Associate Professor, Schulich School of Medicine, Department of Oncology. She has been the clinical lead of clinical trials in Windsor for many years and has been the principal investigator on more than 70 clinical trials in breast cancer, melanoma, and hematological malignancies. She has always been dedicated to improving patient care in her region and to ensuring that patients have access to clinical trials to offer them the best therapy possible. She has been leading a national initiative sponsored by the Canadian Cancer Clinical Trial Network called the Cancer Trials Navigator to improve cancer patient access to clinical trials. And last but not least, as a project manager, clinical research awareness at Q-CROC, Catherine Vayssier coordinates the development of information and awareness tools, as well as activities in collaboration with the member hospitals of the Q-CROC network and patient associations. Before joining Q-CROC, she held a position as coordinator at the Office of the Ethics Committee of the University Hospital of Quebec. This experience allowed her to develop an in-depth knowledge of the clinical research sector in Quebec. Welcome to our three panelists. I'd like to begin, Dr. Brezden-Masley, with you to give us some background on the clinical trial process in general and just a little bit of education for our audience on what it means to be in a clinical trial.
Certainly. Well, thank you for the kind invitation and kind introduction. So a clinical trial really is a research question. So this poses whether or not it is in treatment with the use of understanding whether certain surgery is better than standard surgery, for example, laparoscopic surgery compared to open surgery. There's multiple different levels of clinical trials. It can be also assessing whether or not a PET scan, for example, is better than a CT scan. Assessing whether or not can we detect cancer by using circulating tumor cells and measuring this in the blood of cancer patients. But the ones that we focus on mostly really is whether or not there is systemic therapy. And systemic therapy, when we talk about, is whether or not there are treatments that are better than the standard of care, with the overall arching goal, can we improve the overall clinical care of a cancer patient? These are still experiments. We're still experimenting. We're still adding usually treatments to standard therapy, so standard chemotherapy, for example. And we're trying to understand the research question, can we improve outcomes? Can we improve the survival of our cancer patients? Can we improve and prevent cancer from coming back in patients where we're testing it in the early setting? So that really is what a clinical trial is. Now, there are different types of clinical trials, as I mentioned, but overall, there are phase 1 clinical trials, phase 2 clinical trials, phase 3, and phase 4. Phase 1 are probably what our metastatic cancer patients kind of hear about, because this is really a true experiment. This is the first in human where we're sampling and trying a new novel therapy. And we don't know what the toxicity is in individuals. So we're really pushing the maximum tolerated dose. We're pushing that dose into our patients. So you can imagine our patients who are put on a phase 1 clinical trial. Usually these are patients who have exhausted their therapies, their choices of therapies that are currently available in Canada. So these are novel therapies. As I said, we're pushing that dose. And usually in the metastatic setting. But what's important here is that our patients have to be extremely fit to be put onto this clinical trial. It is not someone who is in bed for 50% or longer within the day. So these are really fit individuals who are put on phase 1 clinical trials. Phase 2, phase 3 are typically the ones that many of us are involved in. You have to remember that there is a huge dedicated infrastructure to running a clinical trial at a cancer center. Unfortunately, in Canada, there are many cancer centers that do offer clinical trials. These phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 clinical trials are typically looking at, can we improve the current standard of care by, say, adding a targeted therapy? For example, in metastatic colon cancer, there may be a target such as HER2, which is a protein that's in about 5 to 7% of colorectal cancer patients. We now have novel targeted therapies for this type of protein that is expressed in 5 to 7% of colorectal cancer patients. So in that 5 to 7% of colorectal cancer patients, standard of care, so say it's chemotherapy such as FOLFOX, can we add trastuzumab or another targeted therapy to that standard of care? And that's what we're assessing. So we're looking at the safety of doing this. We're looking at the efficacy. So is this effective? Do the tumors shrink? If we have liver metastases, do they shrink? And how well is this tolerated? And then there's the improvement in survival of our patients. So these are kind of the endpoints that we're looking in clinical trials. And I just want to ensure that and caution you that not everybody is eligible for a clinical trial. We certainly want as many patients to be participating in a clinical trial, but there are strict eligibility criteria to participate in a clinical trial. So, for example, you have to be usually healthy, you have to have good blood parameters, for example, and you may need to have that target. And so I also want to caution that sometimes it takes a long period of time. So say you see your treating oncologist and you're unwell and you need to start treatment relatively quickly. You may not be the best individual to participate in a clinical trial because in order for you to participate, it might take you 2, 3, 4, 6 weeks. By the time you are ready, you've passed all the tests, all the CT scan, blood tests, sampling of your tumor, there's a target. It might take 6 weeks for you to get on study. So these are some of the cautions in terms of clinical trials. But overall, the whole goal as a clinical trialist is to improve the quality and quantity of life of our cancer patients, to improve overall the cancer care delivery for our cancer patients.
Thank you for that overview. Your deep experience in doing so many clinical trials, do you think that the average patient is generally aware of clinical trials, or is this something relatively new, something that we need to do more education on? Just in general, how well known or understood do we think clinical trials are?
So I think there's been certainly more of an increase in awareness of clinical trials because we're in a social media phase. So I think individuals can certainly find or more savvy in terms of finding, is there a clinical trial? Is there something available? So I do have many patients that do come in, for example, and asking if there are any clinical trials, but there's also many patients that are completely unaware. The most common ask, I think, and Dr. Hamm can probably allude to this too, is can I have my tumor sequenced? Can I have my tumor, is there comprehensive genomic profiling, the big word? Can I have my tumor sequenced so that I can find if there's a target, so I can be put on clinical trial? So that certainly is something that is moving forward, but that is also for certain clinical trials, as I said, the phase 1 clinical trials. But I do find that many patients, if I would say, I'd say 50% of patients are aware, but the big issue is what is available. If someone is living in a remote town, their oncologist may not, for example, be aware if there are clinical trials available to that individual. And that was the whole premise in kind of the Toronto area, and now it's moved also within Ontario, is this whole just to ensure that a lot of this information is available on a web-based portal for medical oncologists to log into.
Yeah, thank you so much for raising the issue of access, and I do want to have a conversation about that as we get into this discussion a little bit more deeply. I think there's very different access availabilities, if I could use that word, on a provincial basis. I think that's a great bridge into to you, Dr. Hamm, and some of the work that you're doing. If you could give us some background on that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I'm the lead of the Clinical Trials Navigator project. We started this in 2019. We were supported by CCCTN, which is the Canadian Cancer Clinical Trials Network. And this elevator pitch of this job is to try to find a clinical trial for anybody in Canada that wants to go on a clinical trial. And that's really our goal. That's a lofty goal, and Christine has really mentioned a few reasons why it won't work. We know from our own experience, but also from previously published literature, that about half the people that want to go on a clinical trial actually have no trial available for them, even if you look. So that's one big barrier. A second barrier, and Dr. Vayssier mentioned this as well, is that about a quarter of people are actually too sick to enter a clinical trial by the time that they're looking for one. And so these are huge challenges that are really difficult to address. It's not necessarily that the patient waited too long to look for a trial. It might just be that their disease is so aggressive that it moves too quickly to get into a trial. We know as well that, as Dr. Vayssier mentioned, that there are a lot of, even the patients may be in smaller centers, and in fact, up to 60% of people are treated in smaller centers, that would have many fewer number of clinical trials available to them at their center. Some cancer centers in Ontario have one clinical trial running right now. And so on average, the 19 centers that are smaller than the big ones have about 15 trials, and there's just not, most people would not be eligible for those trials at their center. So our job is to find clinical trials outside of your center, whether or not it's in Ontario or Canada or even the United States, something that is a reasonable and feasible thing for them to do. So that's really what we're searching to do. We've been running, as I said, we started in 2019, we ran for a year, and then we were shut down by COVID. In fact, clinical trials across Canada were shut down, across the world were shut down because of COVID. And so we were shut down for a couple of years, and now we've just restarted again. So far, we've helped about 200 people find clinical trials. And again, we've run into the same challenges. So out of those, only about 7% have actually entered interventional trials, but that's 7% more than otherwise would have. And a lot of people are looking for trials, not to go on a trial, but to see what's out there for them. And so that's one of the benefits that we have as well. patients can directly access us and physicians can directly access us. So that you don't need to go through your doctor, but we always involve the doctor because the doctor needs to know, doctor needs to make the final decision on whether or not this patient is going to be reasonable for a clinical trial. We've had some lessons learned as well in terms of our Navigator program. We know now it can take up to 10 hours or more to find a clinical trial for someone. There's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of delving into the patient's past medical history, but also trying to understand exactly what the patient's willing to do in terms of entering the trial. How far do they want to go? How much money they want to spend? And so there's a lot of pieces in that work. And so we're working on expanding our human resources and working on a new onboarding platform. So we're training people how to do clinical trial searches. And so that'll be available. We've just hired a new IT company and our website will be up and running in June. And we'll have this all available to people that they'll be able to go onto the website. And if they want to learn how to do a clinical trial search, we'll have it right up there. If they want to help train new clinical trials navigators. And so that'll be available then as well. And we think that's one big stumbling block is people really don't know how to do searches. But we have a team as well that we'll be training and helping people through the trial system. It's a super complex system. It's a difficult system to navigate. So that's what we're here just to try to help them.
Yeah. So Dr. Hamm, can I build on that? Because, how does the average patient find out about a clinical trial? I mean, I think what you're suggesting is that patients can empower themselves to go on to a Navigator site such as you're building to find out themselves. But how does that happen today? And what other resources are around that?
Yeah, it's what we found was a huge gap in the system, that there really are not very many resources to help people find trials. And so we are trying to fill that gap. But it is, I'll tell you, it's a complex gap to fill. It's not there's no simple answer to improving this, but we do know, I think everybody believes and knows clinical trials move science forward. And that's why so many more people are being cured today than that were cured in the past and living longer. We need clinical trials. We need to figure this out. This is just one way we're helping to try to move that needle.
Yeah, thank you very much. Another question I wanted to build on is I love the idea that, you are finding trials essentially globally, but someone in, say, Regina may not even consider that they could participate in a trial somewhere in the US.
There are a few options. There's a few options. So I just matched a patient to a clinical trial in Bethesda, Maryland. And NIH and Bethesda, Maryland is free for Canadian patients. And so I actually had a patient that was flown down every 3 weeks for her clinical trial. And so this is an easy option for patients. I had another patient that went over, Canada is a border country, right? So you can find the closest place and see if there's a trial close to you. I know people in Detroit, I'll call them and say, can this patient come over for free? And sometimes they'll say, yes. I had a patient go over and the pharmaceutical company paid for their trial. I had another patient that his trial, he lived 4 years with metastatic pancreatic cancer, and he paid $15,000 a year for an immunotherapy trial over there. So they're just, like I said, it's complex, but unless we start looking into this, and so part of the website is going to be taking patient groups like yours and having you help us find the pearls of how you manage to find a clinical trial and perhaps help other people.
Yes, thank you very much. So we know that still there's a need to educate about clinical trials. And once you know what a clinical trial is, you have to find one. And then once you find one, you have to accept the fact or understand the fact that these can be run on a global basis. So again, the complexity builds. I think that's a great bridge into you, Catherine, and the work that you're doing at Q-CROC, which is really about, creating some educational tools and doing work in this space to essentially help people understand what this world of clinical trials is all about.
Yes. So thanks to Colorectal Cancer Canada for inviting us to this panel. And as mentioned by Dr. Hamm previously, We know that the access to the information about clinical trial should be easy and the information adapted for the patients. So our organization, Q-CROC, we are based in the Quebec province, in Quebec City, and we are dedicated to the development of clinical research in oncology for the Quebec province. So my speech will be more for the patient from the Quebec province, but can be interesting for people living in other provinces or territories. At Q-CROC, we believe that the patients need to receive the right information about clinical trial at the right time. For example, when they consider participating to a clinical trial or when they discuss with their oncologist or their doctor about their cancer treatment options. So for that, we developed a website dedicated to the information about clinical research. So you can find information about, for example, what is a clinical trial, how to participate to a clinical trial, how you are protected, and you can also find some testimonials from participants to clinical trials. So these people share their experience after the participations in a clinical trial. So it's very complete, it's very up to date too. And on our website for the patient page, you can find the link to a new web platform, which is called Onco Quebec. So it's a tool to help people search for a clinical trial in oncology, but only for the Quebec province. And the people can search specifically, for example, for colorectal cancer. So what is new on this website is that at the end of May, so around in 2 weeks now, a new portal dedicated for the patients will be available with new features to help people searching for a clinical trial. So until now, the website was more for the healthcare professionals. For example, like Dr. Hamm mentioned, to help them to find a clinical trial for their patients. And we know that patients want to have a website more easy to navigate and to be able to find a clinical trial by themselves. So in the same times we launch the new portal, we will offer a new service to help patients with cancer to find a clinical trial. So it's similar, I think, of the service from Dr. Hamm, clinical trial navigation service. So a nurse specialized in oncology will be available for the patient to help them to find a clinical trial. She will be available to help them by phone or by email. She will be able to, gather your medical informations and give information about clinical trial, search for the trial, evidently for your conditions, and even make the contact with the research team. So it's a global offer that we will have for the patient in the Quebec province. So the service is named Onco Plus. So it's this new service. So I invite the people interested by Onco Quebec and this new service of navigation to go on the website Onco-Quebec to learn more about that. So that's the new tools that we think and we develop for the patients with colorectal cancer, but for other cancer for the Quebec province. So that's the new tools and services from Q-CROC.
Congratulations. It sounds like an amazing new initiative. I'm hearing that it is high touch. In other words, there's a lot of personal service that comes with the Navigator. And rather than Dr. Hamm, yours is quite technology oriented, and the individual themselves guides themselves through the process. Is how are these two incredible services integrating for the benefit of a patient? Are the organizations cooperating? Because I think if I'm a patient, I'm thinking, wow, these are amazing resources. I just don't know where to go first. How do I find out how to use you? Do I go to Windsor? Do I go to Quebec? Can we have a conversation, if we look at this through the patient's eyes, is how do they know about you guys? How do they even begin to participate with you in a way that's productive?
Just to answer in a few words, sorry, my English is not my first language, so I try to do my best today. But so what is particular for us is to offer this kind of service in French. So it's very different from other provinces, and it's a huge need for the people who speaking French to find this kind of service in French. So I know very well the service from Dr. Hamm with 3CTN, and I think that it's a wonderful complementary offer for the English speaking people in Canada. So I think that's one of the difference maybe between the two services.
Yeah, I think we actually do very similar things. So we actually have clinical trials navigators, people that talk to people. So the way you access it is currently through the CCTN website, and just Google Clinical Trials Navigator. And then there's a fax number and email that you can just email your requests through. And then we normally respond through email and phone if necessary. Then we can connect your phone if that's needed. So it is actually a very personal kind of interaction. We are developing some technology around trying to develop some matching software, but that's in the works. It's a little tougher, but we are working on that too, just to help the navigator.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's again, the expansion of these services is astoundingly positive. And it sounds like we've got one very focused on Quebec, but one, the Navigator program, Dr. Hamm, that you're working on is more global in nature. So can we have a brief conversation on clinical trials for colorectal cancer specifically? And is there trials that we're aware of? Is how comparatively to other cancers, where does colorectal cancer clinical trial, where does that fit? And I'm happy if any of you are open to taking the question. It's really specifically trying to understand for a colorectal cancer patient, is there clinical trials?
So I can pipe in on that one. So through our, used to be called the NCOIC, but it's now the CCTG. So we do have a Canadian cooperative trials group specifically for cancer. And we just had our spring meeting to talk about trials for colorectal cancer. We certainly have two in the early setting, so stage 2, stage 3, so the curative setting for colorectal cancer. As I mentioned before, we're looking at escalating or de-escalating systemic therapy, so standard of care, if there is evidence of cancer in the blood. So this is known as circulating tumor DNA or circulating tumor cells after that patient has had surgery. So this is a great opportunity to use this novel biomarker to escalate therapy to ensure that we have better survival outcomes for our patients. So that is at any CCTG site. So any throughout Canada, there are many clinical cancer clinics that are part of the CCTG. So it's a big cooperative study. And then there's smaller ones that we're looking at targeted therapies. And I think with colorectal cancer, it's been, I think, a little bit slower compared to other tumors. For example, breast cancer, which I also treat. So there seems to be always a plethora, I think, in breast cancer clinical trials. There's more, I think, targets, and Dr. Hamm also treats breast cancer. And colorectal, I think we're still looking at specific targets. And I mentioned the HER2 because that's one trial that's currently up and running at our center. But we're trying to understand and improve, the targets, understand the targets of colorectal cancer and how we can actually access and provide novel therapies to this population.
Perfect. Thank you. I wanted to, just take it from a patient perspective. Someone listening to this webinar as part of this conference, and asking themselves the question is, well, who do I talk to first? How do I even know if I'm eligible? Is it my oncologist that I go to? Like, where is the starting point for somebody who is interested in exploring a clinical trial? And then the second part of the question is, how do I know if I'm even eligible? Knowing that that's a big question. And we've briefly touched upon eligibility criteria, but just, if we could help folks listening to this understand what is the starting place and how do they even consider the fact that they may or may not be eligible? Just in some,
I can
because
start
it is so,
with that one.
yeah, great.
So I think for sure your oncologist is the first place to start. It's they are the people that will know your disease site the best. They will know you the best, and sometimes they say things you don't want to hear, and that sometimes that's hard if they say that you're not in shape for a clinical trial, and sometimes that's the hard truth, and it is really hard for people to hear that. But still, I think that there is good reason to look yourself as well. So the COMET website, which I've written down now, that we'll add to our website and our search, looking for clinical trials in the Toronto area, depending on where you are. The Q-CROC website, if you're in Quebec, and then clinicaltrials.gov has a lot of clinical trials. Canadian Cancer Clinical Trials is a website you can look on, and Ontario Clinical Trials. These are all like publicly available clinical trials websites. And they can give you an idea. The problem is it's hard to search because it's a whole new language you're learning right now. It's as if I tried to go to learn it, do it in Arabic, because it's a whole new language, cancer, that people don't learn until they enter the world. And so it's really hard for them to do those searches themselves. So again, that's what we're here for, is to try to help to see whether or not there is. I think it's really important people are aware, though, that 50% of people there's no clinical trial available for them, and that's well established in the literature. And 25% of people, and there was another navigating service that the American Cancer Society ran for 3 years, and they found exactly the same thing. About a quarter of the people were too ill for clinical trials by the time they were looking. And so, like Dr. Brezden mentioned, you have to have a certain health in order to end most clinical trials, even the aggressive, the ones that are treating metastatic disease. You have to have a life expectancy of 3 months to enter the trial. And so if your doctor doesn't think that you have that life expectancy, you wouldn't be eligible. So the eligibility criteria is unique for every single trial. Every trial has their own eligibility criteria. There's some common ones. Your blood work has to be good. Your liver function has to be good. Your kidney function has to be good. There's lots of little things. The first step is really trying to find out if there's a trial that fits your broad category, like, MSI, colorectal cancer, what's out there for that right now. And so then you do that, and then you say, okay, that eliminates the vast majority. And then we like to do is get down to 10 trials and start examining those 10 trials to see whether or not you are actually eligible for any of those in that list of 10. And also looking at locations, it has to be close enough for the person to actually do it, because you have to think about the person globally. You know, are they willing to leave their family at this time when they're already sick? And is this the best thing for everyone? So there's so many things to consider when you're deciding. But those are the options, yeah.
And if I can just add in, I mean, these are still experiments. And we are always, we want to push, obviously, we want to improve the care of our cancer patients, but sometimes these experiments don't go the way that we anticipate them to go. And we've seen this in colorectal cancer in the curative setting, where we tested something that worked in the metastatic setting, and it did not work in the curative setting. It was detrimental. So, you know, I just caution that clinical trials are extremely important, and please speak with your treating medical oncologist first, as Dr. Hamm said, because they know your disease, they know you, and it's very important that they can then help navigate a clinical trial if it's appropriate. Really, only 6 to 10% of all cancer patients go on a clinical trial, so it's a small number. And basically with what we had discussed.
Right. Thank you for sharing that statistic. So essentially less than 10% are actually eligible. Can I use that word for a clinical trial? Would that be correct?
Maybe eligible, but there's appropriate. And I think, you know, what both Carolyn and Catherine are doing, I think it just improving that eligibility, improving the navigation, because I think navigation is also the big challenge. Can we improve that to 15 to 20%?
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example. So, yes. Sorry, Princess Margaret Hospital, 20% of their patients go on clinical trials, and in Windsor, it's closer to 3 to 5%. So again, it's you know, that's not equity across the province, right? So, but how many of that 20% are actually Windsor patients that have gone up there? And nobody collects this data. Nobody knows patients traveling between centers and who's going where. And so, you know, this part of what we're trying to do is trying to find out where people are going for treatment, but also making it equitable across the province.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Again, another layer of complexity, which is equitable access. I wanted to, in the last 2 moments that we have on this panel, ask the question that if I'm somebody who is thinking about a clinical trial, if I'm somebody who's actually spoken to my oncologist about this trial, going into a trial, and in fact there is one, but I'm very fearful of a number of different things. What are the things that you hear with all of your expertise about things that people are most afraid of around clinical trials? Things that you would say to them, you shouldn't be afraid because this trial has benefit because. What is that commonality of the number one barrier that you feel we can overcome to getting people into a clinical trial when they are in fact eligible?
So interesting. Oh, go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah. Yes, from my part, I receive often some fear about, you know, to receive a placebo instead of a real treatment. But in oncology, most of the time, you will have a treatment and not a placebo, even if you are in the control group. So it's very important because it's different from other diseases. For oncology, for cancer, the people will always receive the standard treatment or the experimental treatment, but there is always a treatment. So the objective of the clinical trial is to compare what is the best one, but it's an important fear. And also sometimes it's just the fear for the travel. So it's important to know that there is association, to know patient association or organization able to provide some free transportation, these kind of things. So sometimes it's very linked to the real life and the life of the patients for the clinical trial, and not only about the treatment or about the side effects, but sometimes it's worried. They are worried about the real life, transportation and where to live if I need
Yeah.
to go far and these kind of things.
Thank you. Dr. Hamm, you wanted to say something.
Sorry, we did a survey of our patients and where their fears were about entering clinical trials. We're investigating the Navigator service at the same time, but it was interesting, and we polled physicians at the same time, and patients actually put most of their desire to enter a clinical trial on their doctor's opinions, either their family doctor or their oncologist, and less so on their family and friends' experiences, which I thought was interesting. And in fact, it was a very, I think we had 100 patients. So it was a kind of a very select group of people. I think that you have to look at that as well, who can answer online surveys. It's going to be English-speaking people with computers, so we have to limit that. But most of them were very open to going on clinical trials and really didn't have a lot of fear. I think there's a lot of people that speak different languages and don't understand our Canadian system very well. And so we need to maybe make more effort to try to reach out to that patient population that probably doesn't have the same access.
Good. Thank
and
you.
I think
Please.
just another point also, just to add to that, is also they're afraid that if they go on the clinical trial, they can't come off of it. And I think it's very important to say that if a patient can come off a trial at any point that they want to. So it's not like they're stuck into that trial if it's not working for them, that they can come off.
Thank you for reinforcing that. We'll have to end it there, but I first and foremost wanted to congratulate you and each of your organizations on the, I'm going to call it trailblazing work that you are all doing in bringing the clinical trial, let's call it community to life, the issue, sharing the availabilities. It's tough work in a very complex space, as you said, Dr. Hamm. We're going to stop there and open the floor up for questions from our audience. Hello, we have had such a robust session. We really only have time for one question, although I have to say, based on the questions that have been coming on, this is a very important and interesting one. So I'm going to read it to you. There's an upcoming SWOG, SWOG trial for BRAF patients, BRAF patients that will only be available in the US. Do you have advice for Canadians seeking to be on a trial in the US? Anyone, the question is open to.
I could start. So I would do, the first thing I would do is see if it's in Bethesda, Maryland at the NIH website, because those trials are free for Canadian patients. We have had a few patients from Windsor go on. I even had a patient was flown down every 3 weeks for their clinical trial. So, and I know they have a KRAS study going on for colorectal there right now. So they may or may not have a BRAF study. I don't know. But that's the first thing I would do, and that's the easiest thing to do. If you have, you can call the sites where they have trials running and see, if there would be any accommodation for Canadian studies, for Canadian patients. I have been successful in a selected patient population in getting them onto a trial in the United States where they have waived the fees for a Canadian patient. So those are the options. But you have to just call and find out. But NIH, Bethesda, Maryland, that's free for Canadians. So that's be your best bet.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'm going to have to end it there. Just a note to say that there is a range of questions that has been asked of this panel. And our team at CCC is very committed to ensuring that everybody who asks a question gets an answer. So thank you for being available after the session. I want to thank Dr. Brezden, Dr. Hamm, and Catherine for their time and for being with us today, and for sharing the kind of expansive information that's been shared. Thank you.